Okay, so I'm Professor Naveen Thomas. I'm the Vice Dean at the School of Government and Public Policy at the OP Jindal Global University. I'm an economist by training, and I also coordinate the online Masters in Public Policy, which is in its fourth year of running, and we've had a phenomenal experience so far. It's been a long and very enjoyable, yes, and deeply engaging and a learning experience for us, and how we've transformed our residential program into a truly engaging international Masters in Public Policy program. And this webinar, this master class, is an extension of that program. And Professor Namesh, who's going to speak today, he's one of the faculty members teaching on the program. And without any delay, let me very quickly introduce Professor Namesh Kilamasetti, our speaker for the masterclass. He has a PhD in public policy from the University of Amherst, Massachusetts, and in an earlier life, he was a civil engineer and infrastructural planner. And he's even taught civil engineering and worked at some of the top business houses, infrastructure business houses in India. And his research area and interest area is urban planning, urban policy, and urban poverty. And that's where he's going to ground this master class. And he's going to talk about slums, the fourth world. And this is an extremely critical topic because most of city planning doesn't really plan for migrant labor and workers of workers who can't afford expensive uh, city housing. So that sort of creates a dichotomy within cities, especially in the global south. And I think this is an extremely important policy challenge. And also the fact that these slums are not just places of dwelling in general, but these are also places of very intense economic activity, especially in countries where the informal sectors are very vibrant. So, without taking any more time, I pass over the mic to Professor Namesh. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Naveen. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining from. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be a part of this masterclass. I feel immensely grateful for you taking, investing in your interest in this particular topic. If without wasting any further time, let me share my screen and I can start talking about the session. So the end. I hope all of you can see the slides as I'll be moving along. Great. So what I'm going to talk about in today's set, like a masterclass as such, is primarily trying to reflect on the understanding of what do we mean by a slum and why is it so relevant, considering the fact that how the world is going more and more urban in as we're moving along. And along with that, we have a significant population group who live in such informal settlements and do not have access to basic rights, including that of housing and access to livelihood and so on. So my presentation primarily tries to understand the concept of slum in general. A lot of it is kind of a very basic, a lot of it is relying on basic understandings of parameters of what constitutes a slum and some excerpts that I've taken through different projects that I've been working on um, in this particular issue for almost a decade. What I would want to start my presentation is with the series of photographs that I've fallen in love with since the very first time I came to know about it. These photos are taken by this photographer called Johnny Miller for the series called Unequal Scenes. And this is a website that I highly, highly recommend that all of you should check out. Um, as the name suggests, the entire idea of this project of Johnny Miller was to capture the inequalities in urban spaces in a single frame across countries. This photograph that you see represents or shows the slum of Dharavi, which is in the city of Mumbai, is the Asia's largest slum. For those who are from India, you might be slightly aware of how this has been in news for the last few months, if not years. I mean, it has been in years for decades, for that matter, but only in the last few months one of the major business groups in the country, the Adani Group, has been trying to undertake a major redevelopment project in Dharavi. And the entire idea has been to aim to transform it into a modern urban area. As a joint project with the state government, it involves rehousing over 1 million residents and constructing new infrastructure. This is something that has been planned since the last, as I was saying, since the 90s itself. But now it is moving ahead with a master plan and being effect and is be expected to kind of completed by January 2032. Now, there are a series of controversies that are associated with this project itself. I mean, a lot of it, which I'll be breaking down in the coming slides. And the reason why I really wanted to start with this image is when we think of slums as a general narrative, I mean, what might be seen as an issue which is applicable only in, say, the bigger metropolitan cities in India or that of the South or that in the southern Asian context is something that has been affecting the urban areas all across the world. So how big is this issue? I mean, I pardon me, I am citing a figure from 2006, and there's a reason why I am doing that. I'll talk about it. So this, I mean, this incredible book called Planet on Slums, which was written by Mike Davis, where he talks about how there are over 1 billion people, or say 1 in 7 people on the planet living in slums. And in these years, it is expected that with the growing urbanization that I was mentioning about, it is estimated that more than 3 billion people would be approximately living in slums by the year 2030. Now, the reason why we do not have a figure, an updated number, is that governments across the world have still not and are not comfortable at all in releasing these numbers in terms of the number of people who live in such informal settlements, the number of people who are affected, who need intervention. And because of that, it's absolutely becomes a very difficult challenge to understand the scale and extent to which the problem of slums has been in in cities across the world. There have been multiple policy interventions that have been applied by governments to improve the lives of the urban poor, but none have them in a panacea, and slums continue to be thriving across all the cities. And what happens is you often end up with these densely populated and neglected parts of the cities where housing and access to basic services such as water and sanitation are poor. Now, before even moving in, when we try to understand the meaning of the word slum as such, if you look at the etymology of it, it comes from 18th century Victorian English that actually identified slums as those areas in London that were the places of criminal activities and where thugs would actually live. And it was that connotation that kind of was started getting commonly used across all the cities in the world. In fact, Jeremy Seabrook, the author of Pauperland, he provides an argument in terms of how slums should not be called as the word slums itself, because it reminds of this British concept of this gnarly place of criminal activities and how it has been unfairly adapted globally. But as in this stage, it becomes applicable where you have to kind of where it's important to refer to slums as community of poor people. As a matter of fact, across multiple conferences and many events, I've come across many scholars who often get very angry when someone uses the word slums to talk about these communities, because they start because of the connotations that it's attached. However, despite its negative connotations, these areas are still commonly called as slums, and in my opinion, calling them with a different name does not take away the challenges that people are living in them. And one of the first things we need to understand is how do we define a slum? Um, there are multiple terminologies that are used across cities in the world to kind of identify such locations. I mean, in the case of India itself, you have terminologies like chawls, which are used in cities like Ahmedabad and Mumbai, bastis, which are used in Eastern India in cities like Calcutta, jhuggi jhopadis in the city of Delhi. And then as we move further, kachi abadis is a term which is used in cities like in Pakistan, kampungs in Indonesia and Thailand, and favelas in Rio. So in order to kind of understand what exactly are the challenges that are there, one needs to really have a local context of what is happening. And the first step of understanding the local context is making a sense of the different terminologies that are there in the slum. And then you kind of think through, okay, what is the way in which you define these issues? So the UN Habitat in 2002 came up with this definition where they said that, okay, a slum household is a group of individuals where if you have a group of individuals living under the same roof and lack one or more of the following, either that is access to improved water, access to improved sanitation, security of tenure, durable housing, and sufficient living space. Since then, many governments across the world have been trying to use that as a basis to kind of identify slums. However, the challenge has been that there is a complete lack of a universally agreed definition. There are multiple definitions that meet the common perception of what a slum is, that have been created by organizations such as that of the UN, the World Health Organization, even with respect to different governments at the different level. Often, in the case of India, you have a census of India, which has formulated its own definition. Often, state governments and local governments have their own versions of definitions as well, all of which kind of leads to a challenge of what are the operational ones which would enable to ascertain if a particular area is a slum or not. As a matter of fact, this was one of the first projects that I had undertaken, trying to understand this entire idea of the defining the challenges around defining a slums, where I try to compare the definitions provided by various organizations with respect to parameters such as lack of ventilation or sanitation, access to safe drinking water, structural quality, overcrowding, living area, security of tenure. Covering all the parameters while all the definitions missed some or the other. It was the UN Habitat that you see that kind of covers all the basic aspects. In the context of India, it was the slum census in 2011, which was the first and the last slum census that was done, came to the closest possible to what the UN Habitat definition is. Yet, they did not cover security of tenure as an aspect of defining a slum. Seems like a small enough issue. Well, I'll tell you how much variation that it make. If you look at the government of India estimates, the total number of people that lived in slums was 94 million people based on the 2011 slum census. The same, so it was a matter of coincidence. The UN Habitat also undertook a similar survey in 2011, trying to understand the prevalence of slums and incorporating security of tenure. They came up with a number of 154 million people for the same year. So you have a difference of 60 million people just because of security of tenure as an aspect. So here the challenge then comes down to understanding on agreeing on a single definition. If you don't agree on a single definition, the size of the problem would vary drastically, right? So as a policymaker, now the challenge for me is to understand or kind of think through is if I need to actually provide shelter to 154 million people or 90 million people. Factors like this tried kind of encouraged me or inspired me to really study further in terms of what is it that is happening here. So, and as I was saying before, I mean, the entire understanding, the reason why slums are kind of like the population of people living in slums um, in urban areas is increasing year by year is primarily because of urbanization. I mean, if we really think about it, as of now, we have around 8.2 billion people, which means that almost half of where almost that means the 4 billion people are actually living in urban areas itself. And it is expected that around all of this, and where more than three-fourths of this population growth is actually happening in the global south. When you look at countries like India, they are one of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world, where the UN estimates actually expect the urban population to double from 460 million that was in 2018 to over 870 million by 2050. So what is happening is now you have slums as spontaneously emerging as a dominant and a distinct type of settlement in the cities of the urban world. Since 2000, the global slum population actually grew on average by 6 million people every year. Or if I really break it down further, to the extent of 16,500 people every day moving to slums, migrating from rural areas. a lot of this migration or a lot of this moving to slums is with this aspiration of increasing the levels of incomes for people who with the limited access to livelihood sources in rural areas. There's a lot of younger age groups that are moving in with the hope of earning money and remitting it back to their places. And nuclearization of families is also something that has been studied extensively as possible reasons for the existence of slums. A significant reason on the creation of urban slums is poverty, which in itself is a multidimensional phenomenon. When urban poverty as a term is something that has been widely discussed and debated in terms of its definitions and applications. However, we look at, we can actually say that urban poverty is a multidimensional phenomenon which affects various parameters such as income, security, education, health, etc. The urban poor are forced to live with many of these deprivations, the agglomeration of which makes them vulnerable or sustainable to various risks. So when we really think about it, urban poverty can be seen as a form of poverty that is particularly visible in megacities, um, characterized by poor living circumstances and income, as well as a lack of essential utilities and a bad quality of life. And it exists everywhere, just in different manifestations. As a matter of fact, when I was saying before that when we think of urban slums, a lot of it is attributed to cities in the global south, such as that of in the African subcontinent or that of Southern Asia. But when you really think about it, slums as a phenomenon has been a challenge for even cities in the global west, in the global north as well. Cities like New York, Paris, even New York has been struggling with issues, trying to understand how to take care of the different manifestations of slums. I mean, in the US, it is often through the issues of ghettos that is seen across its neighborhoods. In many cities, homelessness is an aspect where often you'd see people living in really flimsy materials or even no housing material at all. So these all can be seen as different manifestations of urban poverty that is affecting in a city. Now, when you think of this impact of urban poverty, you can look at it as a cyclical process where all of these issues are connected to each other. When you really think about it, a person, if you start from the bottom top, so if you start from the top right corner, so it's often the inability to afford adequate housing is one of the reasons why people are forced to live in slums. Living in a slum often, because they do not have ownership to the property or to the land where they're living in, they often have to live in the fear of tenure and security, where they can be evicted anytime by the state authorities or the owner of the land, right? Because of which they cannot invest in large amounts in the house that they're living in. Now, that tenure insecurity leads to them forced to living in unhygienic living conditions, right? And the areas often have very poor quality of public services like water supply, sanitation, sewerage, and so on. Poor living conditions and public services in turn leads to poor health and poor education. Poor health and poor education leads to a lack of employment, not having proper access to job, regular income, and that again, all of it leads to being unable to afford adequate housing, right? Amidst all of these steps, you realize that these different factors of urban poverty that you see are interlinked to each other, where one factor leads to the other. And the biggest impact of urban poverty on an individual is the sense of insecurity, isolation, and disempowerment, which further leads to a downward spiral of events. Um, and there is a book by Matthew Desmond on called Evicted, which was published in 2017, where he kind of talks about how families which are spending more than 70% of their income on rent and utilities not only have less money to spend on wellness and healthcare, but also regularly face eviction and homelessness, which further threaten their health, right? So it is not just an issue of housing as such when I'm talking about understanding slums as a phenomenon, right? I'm talking about the understanding of lack of access to health, to education, livelihoods. It is an interdisciplinary issue that affects multiple aspects of how an individual lives. And when I look at it from an intersectional perspective as well, there are certain aspects that often play which that often play a much more critical role, and has been backed by studies or scholarly literature as well. Multiple papers have highlighted that women and the third gender are affected a lot more than men when they are living in slums. And that has been documented through multiple ways. One of the common examples that of being that women often have to walk long distances to collect water, often to the extent of spending 5 to 6 hours every day, which often disables them to kind of engage in other livelihood generation activities. Um, when you talk of caste, specifically in the Indian context or in South Asia for that matter, it's often people from the lower caste groups that are forced to live in these slum-like conditions. And in fact, even in my own research, it has been fascinating to observe that even within a single slum, where you would have people of the same caste group, even you would have demarcations with respect to the subcastes of people within the same caste groups. So you'd realize that there is a hierarchy even in the subcaste groups of people that belong to a same caste. So in that way, a person or a family that is of the lowest subcaste group are often the ones that are excluded, living on the peripheries of the slum, and do not even have the absolute basic necessity or access to public services, which is already minimally existing in that particular location. Class is something that has been studied extensively. People, as I was saying before as well, I mean, people are forced to live in these areas because they do not have the financial capabilities of living in an area that is better serviced and has better amenities as well. However, even within the slum, class often plays a major role in terms of understanding up to what extent you be affected by living in a slum. Again, I remember watching this incredible documentary a few months ago, where they talked about the class differences of houses that are in the slum of Dharavi in Mumbai. Now, most of Dharavi is a low-lying area which gets flooded regularly during the monsoons. And there was the study that showed that often people who were from a higher class group would build houses that are at a higher pedestal level as compared to other houses. In that way, their houses have less occurrences of getting flooded than the others. So that was basically a good identifier for surveyors and demographers to kind of make sense of households that are doing that are in a higher class group than the other. Geographic backgrounds, again, studies have shown that especially in smaller cities, it's usually people from the same geographic backgrounds, from the same villages who often congregate together and live in that particular slum especially when the slum would have just started, especially people would have just started moving in, they kind of settling in over time. It's when people from other neighborhoods and all come in, and even for a new migrant who would have just come to urban area from their hinterland, it's usually the slum which would have people from their native village is the place where they would end up going. And again, political ideology is something that has been extensively studied. Slums have traditionally been seen as a vote bank for politicians, and of the reasons for the persistence of slums to exist. With the idea that politicians come, make promises, and those promises are enough to build aspirations for people to have a hope that something might change. And the process keeps on repeating over years. So there are these intersectionalities on the basis of which slums have been studied. Now, with all of these problems, you would expect that yes, there has been responses or multiple approaches that have been taken by governments, and that has been the case. I mean, if you really think about it, there is a long history of slum policies globally. First from the industrialization era, and then in the last 7 decades. And this is something that has been applicable for almost all countries in the global south. Surprisingly, though, when you really like kind of think about it, these policies have only evolved around six major ideas that focus on improving housing and living conditions. Uh, in the 1950s, it started with the idea of doing nothing at all. And that was with an assumption that slums are a very temporary phenomenon, and they are transient. That once people start earning more money, they will leave those settlements and move to better neighborhoods, um, which obviously did not happen. This was followed by construction of public housing units. This is something, and that involved demolitions and forced evictions. And to this day, it is still considered as one of the most common ways of dealing with slums. So, this demolitions and forced evictions are seen as a replacement of the demolished slums. As a matter of fact, in Delhi, the capital of India, there were massive evictions in the last couple of months itself, where almost over 100,000 people were evicted, and they're still waiting for resettlement to happen. I mean, and then again, there is a different issue in itself in terms of identifying who is a eligible beneficiary to go to the resettlement housing. The process of documentation and identifying who is basically a legitimate beneficiary and who is not has own set of controversies. It was in the 1970s where the World Bank came up with this idea of the sites and services. With the premise was very simple that land parcels would be given to the slum dwellers, often at the outskirts of the city, and it was expected that the community would be using that to build their own homes that meet building standards. Multiple cities in the African subcontinent and in South Asia were used as pilots for these kind of projects. And unfortunately, they expected that over time these areas would get subsumed as part of the city, which unfortunately did not happen. Ironically, I think it was sometime in the early 2000s where a couple of World Bank scholars cherry-picked two pilot projects. One was in Chennai in India, and the other was in Nairobi, where they took these two case studies of sites and services projects which had successfully integrated to the city, and came across with this fascinating paper which was titled as "Success When Everyone Called It Failure." Right. So, World Bank has been kind of looking at sites and services even to this day as a strong solution to the problems. However, it was the failures of the sites and services that policymakers started realizing the advantages of in situ upgradation. So the meaning of in situ upgradation is basically when slum dwellers are not evicted from their original location, and the access to basic services like sanitation, roads, water supply is provided in the original location where they live. It was only in the 2000s that in situ upgradation was completed with tenure security, that is ownership of the land that they're living in, where it was promoted by this Peruvian economist called De Soto, who argued that providing legal rights to the lands and houses that poor occupied de facto could unlock the financial potential hidden in those informal homes, and in turn could alleviate poverty. Now, despite this idea being criticized extensively, this policy option remains popular across states and countries even today. In the last 2 decades, discussions have started moving to this idea of making cities slum free, which is unfortunately mostly a rhetoric with no particular policy prescription. And while many programs, even in India, have elements of these interventions, but in itself, slum free city is often seen as a goal than rather than an intervention itself. At the end, when you think of adequate housing, it is increasingly accepted as a human right and considered more from the perspective of an urban equity and an inclusion perspective. Millennium Development Goals in the beginning of this century, and later on the ambitious SDGs, have also called for renewed policy attention and investments to ensure affordable and adequate housing to all by 2030. With all of this policy still going on, there are still some problems. Why is it that these problems are still persisting? As I was saying, in the earlier cases, for some decades till after the Second World War, while informal settlements were spreading and growing in many cities, the public authorities turned to choose a blind eye. The logic being that these proliferations were very temporary, and with the ongoing economic processes, people flooding in from the countryside would be absorbed in the formal city. That never happened. The second major reason was were very overly focused on public housing that failed on multiple reasons. One was that the construction drive addressed only a very small fraction of the housing demand because of the high costs involved in construction of such large scale public housing units. Um, there were serious problems caused by the poor and inadequate design and construction of those public housings, along with their location that were usually in the outskirts of the cities. The third was the participation, where it was often seen that the participation of the informal communities in the policymaking process was very poor, where political pressure and corruption also played a major role. In many cases, slum dwellers were ready, but the politicians were not. Finally, the fourth was this lack of emphasis on infrastructure development, where cities need investment in human infrastructure and physical development, um, which cities in developing countries are unfortunately not investing. I mean, India is the worst in that case. While cities in North America are growing at the rate of almost 1 to 2% per year, cities in India are growing at a rate of almost 5% per year. But the provision of infrastructure has not matched that growth. And finally, a phenomenon of what I call it as a copy paste syndrome is that many planning regulations, standards, and administrative processes have been inherited or imported from countries where the economic, social, institutional, and climatic conditions are very different from that of the South. For example, building regulations in the Southern African Kingdom of Lesotho are based off that of Sweden. Building regulations of that of the highlands of Papua New Guinea um, are actually based off the city of Sydney and Melbourne, right? So in such cases, you realize that urban planning is actually not Western planning. You need to recognize the need to manage this rapid urbanization, right? And for that, the first thing is needing to understand what exactly is a problem. Is slums the real problem in itself, right? A lot of it, there's been a lot of discussion in terms of how do you actually deal with slums. Are they a potent symbol of the failure of the society to address the basic needs of the majority? Or is it the responsibility of the public housing to provide housing for its citizens? This discussion in terms of looking at slums as locations of hope or locations of despair has been kind of growing on for a long time. And this discrepancies and kind of confusion is something that has been challenging people everywhere. One of the examples why which reinforces this challenge is looking at the way we connotate slums. I mean, this is a recent project that I'm working on where we are doing a systematic review of all the incidents of how policymakers and people at power have actually officially kind of talked about slums in their speeches or in their rhetorics. And you can see some of the narratives that are coming in, right? You see slums are seen as cancerous growth. People talk about slums as eyesores. A lot of the policies, when they are discussed, is with an idea of thinking of kind of demolishing slums altogether and building cities like Shanghai. That's why it's called Operation Shanghai, or this idea of creating slum-free city, right? So in fact, the slum-free city was something that the government of India had. Slum-free by 2020 was a slogan that was adopted by the government of India in 2012. And this was something that was a part of the election manifesto as well. But all of this, as you can kind of really see, is always with this narrative that slums are dirty, slums are something very negative, and that need to be removed at the earliest. But what scholars and what practitioners have been kind of advocating for a long period of time is this idea is that slums are seen as a building block to how the city grows, right? If it was not for the spaces where people um, from rural areas or elsewhere can come and kind of find themselves a part of it, there is no way that cities can grow. So instead of looking at it from a negative perspective of cleansing the city of slums, the idea of identifying ways in which you can integrate is something that is seen as a lot of promise. All right, Naveen, how much time do I have?
We can go for another minute or so. Probably
All
three
right.
minutes tops.
Perfect. Yeah. So in that case, I will just quickly talk about this case study and then I'll end my discussion, kind of leaving you in a question. So this is of a particular case. This is of a particular slum that I've been working on recently, a few years ago. This is located in a city in a state called Odisha, which is located in the eastern part of the country. This particular slum has been there since the 1980s, where people moved in from the nearby rural areas in search for better employment opportunities. Now, one thing that you'll realize as you look in the photographs is that this particular slum is right next to a major drain channel, like a major drain channel, right? So, most of the sewage actually flows from a large part of the city, ends up flowing into through the slum and passes through a nearby water body, right? So what that means is that the slum, unfortunately, in every monsoon is heavily inundated. It overflows, reptiles creep in. There are people, kids, there were deaths that were reported every year. The kids getting bitten by snakes, with dengue, typhoid, and so on. Um, but at the same time, almost every resident over here has been working and contributing to the local economy by across any informal services. So sometime in the last 10 years, the government came across with this idea and built this public housing unit, which I should have said that this particular slum was already located in the outskirts of the city. So the government came up with this response and built this massive public housing unit, which was located further 12 miles away from that slum itself, which was in the periphery, right? And said that, okay, we've built this housing unit for you. It has all the amenities that you need for in terms of water supply. You have electricity. Now you don't have to be worried about getting submerged during monsoons, and you have a house. But yet, it's been almost 10 years, and every resident has been protesting to move to this housing, right? With the argument that, well, if we move here, what happens to our access to livelihood? What happens to all the social capital that we have built over time? And under such a juncture, then you start realizing that the solution to slum is not a binary. It's not a one or zero that, okay, we either demolish slum or we provide this. Then the challenge becomes is you look at the need to look at it from a very intersectional perspective. So I end my presentation with this question to you. So I think this is something that you can leave in the comments as well. I mean, with this pretext, which side do you really think is right? I mean, the slum community, for having lived there for 40 years, has all of its networks over there and believes that they have the right to live there. They have the documentation as well that they've collected over time. Whereas the government, which is saying that you live in a hazardous area and we are trying to save you from your death by moving to this housing. And this is kind of an issue that will come across almost every slum in almost all the cities across the world in terms of the interventions that are being provided there. All right. Thank you so much. And I look forward to the questions that are coming in. I see a lot of messages that were coming in the chat box. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Namesh. This was extremely engaging and very informative. I think we've all learned how to define slums and the intersectionality of that not just being a place of residents, but also the other social as well as economic aspects. So, but
Mhm.
let's explore some of these themes in the Q&A session. Let me probably start with some of the questions that are in the Q&A box, and I encourage everybody to put their questions in the Q&A box for ease. It's just far more organized this way. So if you've put your questions in the chat box, please try and transfer them to the Q&A box. It'll be easier for us to take these questions as we go. So let me start with the very first one by Shivangini. She asks, does the PM Awas Yojana not aim to eradicate areas of living um, like the slums?
All right. For those who are not from India, PM Awas Yojana literally translates to the Prime Minister's housing scheme. This was a flagship housing program that was implemented by the ruling government in 2014. And the entire idea was to provide subsidies and kind of support for people to build houses. And there were four verticals, out of which one of the vertical was slum redevelopment, where the idea was slum dwellers would be able to kind of take a subsidy of over 200,000 rupees, that comes to approximately around 2,500 US dollars, where they can use that amount to construct a house in the very location that they've been living, provided they can prove documentation that they're living in that place for the last 25 years or so. Now, on paper, that seems like a great idea. What happened in reality, or the biggest challenge that came to it, was identifying who is a beneficiary and who is not. Remember, I told this in the presentation as well. In this very context as well, many state governments added a clause that a community would be accessible, would be considered, a family would be considered eligible for the PM Awas Yojana scheme only if they have not been a beneficiary for any scheme that might have been implemented in the past, right? So, and that could include a scheme that would have led to being provision of a drinking water tap in that particular house, right? Or it could be for provision of a sewerage network. So that automatically kind of made many families not eligible for that scheme. However, there are many cities where slum dwellers have been able to kind of use this particular scheme to be able to redevelop their house. The other side of it was has been this discussion that the amount of $2,500 that I was saying enough has not been enough, is not enough to build a house. So even in my field work, I've come across multiple instances where all the family has been able to do is just build two walls and a roof, which is completely unplastered, right? That again has multiple issues, and they just do not have money to complete the basic amenities to finish the house. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Ramesh. So the next question is by Sagar Chandola. He asks that, well, he says that, well, India has had the Slum Areas Improvement and Clearance Act of 1956. Despite this act, why have the regulators not been able to throw people out of slums and sort of ban such settlements?
The answer is the Slum Areas Act, as you mentioned, was something that was devised in 1956, and in fact, in the 80s, that was seen as the primary way of dealing with slums, of just evicting the slums as it is and kind of paving way for development. But as I was saying, it is not a binary issue. A lot of it has political motivations, and that primarily is because of the people who live in those areas. I mean, imagine again, you have thousands of people living in a densely crowded area for years, who are your probable vote banks for any elected leader who wants is standing from that particular city or area. So it's kind of that, again, this has been something that has been documented extensively in terms of how easy it is often is to kind of make promises to these communities to kind of provide better services to in return for being voting for them. And that is one big reason why slums have continued to exist. There are other reasons as well that include, in many cases, the owners of the land, if not the government. In those cases where when the owners of the land is not the government or the Indian Railways, is often the politicians of as a part of the nexus themselves, where they collect large rents from these families who live there. So there are multiple reasons why, and not a single answer to kind of say why the Slum Areas Act has not been efficient. And as a matter of fact, there are multiple other policies that have come up after the Slum Areas Act in the last 3 decades to tackle with these issues, but the challenges primarily continue remaining the same.
Thanks, Nimish, for that. So there's another question by Diana. She asks if there are some cases of successful slum policy that's really worked, and can you give us a policy where, uh, as a case study that
Yes.
we can possibly look at?
Sure. There have been successful interventions. It's not all sad stories. There have been successful interventions in where slum policies have been able to make a difference. One of the most successful ones, again, is something what is called as the Slum Networking Project, the SNP, which was implemented in a couple of cities in India in the early 2000s. The entire idea of the Slum Networking Project was that the local government would tie up together to tie up with a major with a major private entity or a organization that is doing well in that particular location. And as a part of the corporate, as the corporate social responsibility of that particular private entity, they would use their funds along with that of the local municipal corporation to kind of provide funds for building the public services in that given city, sorry, in that given slum. This was implemented in a couple of cities in Western India and had great success. However, they've tried scaling up, and as you can expect, not all private players are really interested to fund a big amount in developing slums. So that has not been able to scale up. However, there have been some success stories of community-led interventions as well. One of that is that in the city of Karachi in Pakistan, where the slum communities themselves crowdsourced funds from each and every resident to kind of install sanitation lines, pipes in the city. The same thing has been done in Thailand as well. So it's called as the Ban Mangkong project, where community organizations kind of made each family to contribute a part of their income, which was pooled together and used for development or infrastructure in the slum. So there have been examples of such micro level or small scale interventions, but at a large scale is still something that we have been kind of looking for. I mean, there are a couple of states in India that have moved ahead moved ahead with this solution of providing with providing ownership of land to all the slum dwellers living in the state. That In that particular case, and along with the provision of tenure security, they're also focusing on provision of infrastructure services as well. This, in fact, the state of Odisha that I'm talking about in Eastern India has this Land Rights Act, which is called as the world's largest tenure security program. Now, that has seen some initial success, but the rates of success has again varied with respect to the scale in which it is done. So in smaller towns and cities, it is being implemented very successfully, but in large cities, it has still been a challenge.
Thanks for that, Nimish. How much time do we have? We have time for at least two questions.
Couple of questions, yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question by Jaya.
Hmm.
Jaya says that she was from a slum colony,
Hmm.
Singareni,
Hmm.
and she's made it from a slum to TEDx, and she's doing a PGDM in
That's great.
and she's a first generation learner from her family.
Hmm.
And she asks, I really want to know your perspectives on people living in the slums who really want to achieve. So there are aspirations for slum dwellers, and
Hmm.
what do you feel their aspirations are? And how do you generate awareness for the negligence that slum dwellers face? Right. So let's start with that.
That's kind of a tough question to unpack. I mean, when you're talking of aspirations, I mean, I think they have slum communities, people living in slums should have the same aspirations as everyone else living in an urban area. That is to be able to live in that particular city without having the fear of being thrown out, right? Let me unpack this using the recent example of evictions in Delhi that I was talking about, right? There have been massive evictions in in slum communities across the Delhi, and in most of these cases, these slums have been there for over 50 to 60 years, right? These slums were located in lands that were either owned by the government or by the railways, and over time, even the city has provided all the valid documentation that makes them claim as a resident of the city and eligible for all services. In fact, even services were provided as well. And then suddenly, after 50 years, the government realizes that no, okay, you are living in a government land, therefore you cannot be deemed as a part of the city, therefore we have all the right to kick you out. So, does that make a legitimate claim? That just because is that the one of the biggest challenges that I believe when it comes to discussions on slums, or even the responses from the government, is the focus on land and not people, right? The moment any government or the moment a policy focuses more on people than the land itself, I would see the problems of slums getting resolved, right? I mean, even from a government's perspective, it's the value of the land and the financial the financial implications it has that actually is of more interest than the development of the people living in it. And unfortunately, that's one reason why it becomes easier for governments to decide and go ahead with massive evictions without any repercussions for that matter. I don't know if I did any justice of answering your question, but I think this is what my views are.
Okay. Well, that's perfectly fine, Namesh. I think you have answered to the question to a large extent. You know, I just want to ask you a question from my side, just to sort of open up the economic aspects of slum dwelling. Because, as you said, we often dichotomize slums as well. Um uh, Housing for the poor when there are no provisions by the government, and
Mm,
then the formal as housing for the rich, especially in urban land markets where prices sort of shoot through the roof, and
mm,
land is a very valuable commodity.
sure.
Well, besides the distance, is it also a lack of our understanding of what slums are in terms of their economic identity that makes us
Hmm.
miss the point and probably sort of misplaces the slum redevelopment strategies? Because slums are also they're an exceptionally important location for informal economic activity,
Absolutely.
right? So, an economic informal activity often for, um, sorry, informal activity is often a very large part of overall economic activities, especially in developing countries,
Mm.
including India, where the informal sector generates large numbers of employment opportunities. So, is this also a problem um, of a policy failure of decent work generation
Hmm.
as well,
Hmm.
that is also causing the challenge of slums? Or what, I mean, I just want to very quickly throw that question out there and elicit your thoughts on that.
Yeah, bang on. I mean, one of the reasons why Dharavi redevelopment plan in the city of Mumbai has has been extended or delayed for the last 30 years is because of the massive economic value the slum brings to the economy of the city, right? The micro industries that are located in Dharavi are a $1 billion industry, right? Which cater to multiple domains, and and it has been and it has been advocated heavily that it's the location of the city, of the location of the slum in the city as well, that plays a major factor of the community being able to contribute this much, right? And all this discussion of being resettling the people living in Dharavi to multi-story public housing units would completely destroy this economy that is situated there, because a lot of these small scale industries that you can talk about are actually people working using a part of their house as a warehouse or as a factory, right? Which is again not possible when you are living in a multi-storied building. So that is one big reason why, I mean, these discussions of redeveloping Dharavi has always taken a stall in the last 40 years. And even now, it's only because of the power that the Adani group has and the influence it has that it has been able to kind of take this step ahead. But still, there are massive set like pushbacks that are being given over this very aspect. And it's the same across the country. I mean, slums have a potential of apps of high economic of the high intrinsic value that they bring to the city's local economy, mostly even through the informal nature that they have. And even in this particular case, the slide that I've ended with, it's interesting that one of the reasons initially the slum that I was showed was while located next to the located next to at the next to the drain and all of that. As soon as there was a notice given for eviction and people were protesting for the last 8 years, a lot of the support to the protest was also given by middle class neighborhoods that were located around the slum itself, because even they realized that if the community gets resettled 15 miles away, all the people working at their houses as maids and cooks and security guards and so on would not be able to continue their work, right? So it's high time, like even city governments kind of understand the value that informal economy brings in, and that again comes out from the people who are living in these areas, and that if not, that itself being the biggest incentive to redevelop the slums in the very location that they are in.
Yeah, that's deeply insightful, Namesh, and I
Mm,
think we'll end with that. We have a lot more questions, but we will grossly exceed time
mm.
if we take even one more question. I also want to I want to begin by thanking you for
Of course.
the insightful presentation
Mm,
and this very interesting discussion that we've had. Although we
mhm.
weren't able to take all questions, but I think we've made some great inroads into understanding informal housing and slums, and the definitions as well as the politics and economics behind it. Having said that, I also want to let the participants know that our program in public policy has a dedicated course on urbanization and development, where you learn you learn some of these aspects, especially urban policy, in a lot more detail. Do check up our program website. The Coursera team has posted these links for you in the chat box. Do take a look at our program and do apply for it if it interests you. You've been a great audience, and thank you for joining in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Take care, everyone. See you at the next masterclass. Take care. Bye.